Hello, I'm Jeff Allen Wolf. This is A World Gone Mad. The results of the voting Tuesday before midterms were very, very encouraging. And Tuesday night's numbers out of Texas weren't just encouraging, they were a flashing red light for anyone who thinks the political energy in this country is normal right now. Okay, here we go. Look at the turnout Tuesday night. In earlier midterm cycles, such as in the 2000s, Democratic vote totals in those races were often around 978,000 votes. Last night, Democrats pulled roughly 2.3 million votes, and that number was still climbing with only 92% of the vote counted. That's not a small shift. That's a massive jump in participation that political strategists in both parties are staring at this morning. And that's the historical piece that makes this even more striking. This is the first time since 2002, that Democrats have outvoted Republicans in a midterm environment. So when you see numbers like that, the question isn't just what happened in Texas last night. The question is what those numbers are already starting to lead to politically. Because if that kind of turnout energy is real, and if it continues into November, it doesn't stay in Texas. It spreads across the political map, and it starts shaping the races that will decide who controls Washington. Which brings me directly to the Senate battlefield. One of the biggest races to watch this year is in North Carolina. Former Governor Roy Cooper has now won the Democratic nomination for the United States Senate. On the Republican side, the nominee will be former RNC Chairman Michael Whatley. Now, the two of them will face off in November for the seat currently held by Republican Senator Thom Tillis, who's retiring in January. And Democrats are looking at that race very seriously because if Cooper wins it, it could help flip control of the Senate. And you, the listener, need to be aware of one thing if you're not already aware. Roy Cooper has never lost a political race he entered. Never. This race in North Carolina is not small stakes. This isn't a symbolic race. This is the balance of power in the United States Senate potentially shifting because of a handful of states where turnout and voter momentum suddenly matter a lot more than they did 6 months ago. Now tie that back to what we just saw in Texas. One of the clearest political contrasts to come out of Texas was between James Tallarico and Jasmine Crockett. USA Today described the contest as a gut check for Americans over how best to confront Trump and win over swing voters. But one number from that race jumped out immediately. Tallarico won Latino voters by 27 points. That matters because the dominant narrative over the past several election cycles has been that Latino voters were aligned with Donald Trump and the Republican Party. A 27-point margin in the other direction tells a very different story. It suggests Latino voters are still very much in play and that the way Democrats message their campaigns still matters enormously. And if that margin is even close to holding in other states, the political map everyone thinks they understand right now may not look the same by November. Because turnout, like we saw last night, doesn't just change one race. It changes expectations. And expectations are exactly what starts flipping Senate seats. The Pentagon and the media are now fighting over how the Iran war is being covered. And honestly, it's starting to look like two completely different movies depending on who you're listening to. Defense Secretary Hegseth keeps stepping up to the microphone, basically saying, the mission's working, the targets are being hit, everything's going according to plan. While a big chunk of the press is looking at the same situation and saying, okay, but can we ask a few follow-up questions before we start printing the victory banners? From the Pentagon's point of view, the military is doing exactly what it set out to do. Strikes are happening, Iran's capabilities are being degraded, and the operation's moving forward. That's the official narrative. But if you watch the coverage that's irritating Hegseth, reporters keep focusing on intelligence leaks, civilian casualty questions, and whether the strategy actually does what the administration says it does. Which, by the way, is what reporters have done during basically every war since the invention of the printing press. Hegseth didn't exactly take that criticism quietly. At one point, he accused reporters of practically rooting against the operation simply because Donald Trump's the president ordering it. Now think about that for a second. The Defense Secretary of the United States is standing there suggesting the press might be politically biased while covering a war. You know, that's like a referee at a football game accusing the fans in the stands of having strong opinions about the teams. Of course they do. That's literally how the system works. Meanwhile, the war itself keeps moving forward. The United States and Israel have already struck thousands of targets inside Iran as this campaign expands. Now, the Pentagon says the objective's simple: damage Iran's missile capability, cripple key military infrastructure, and make sure those systems can't just pop back up a few months from now. That's the strategy being presented to the public. But the battlefield has a nasty habit of ignoring tidy explanations. Even with overwhelming military power in the region, Iranian attacks are still going through. A drone strike recently killed 6 U.S. soldiers, and military officials have already acknowledged that more casualties could happen as the conflict continues. That's the part of the story nobody gets to spin into a clean talking point. So right now there's really 2 battles unfolding. One's the actual military conflict in the Middle East. The other's the argument here in Washington over how that conflict should be described to the American public. One side wants to emphasize strength and momentum. The other side keeps asking how this war ends and how big it could get. And if you watched American politics for more than about 15 minutes, you already know something important about that second battle. Because the way a war is explained to the public often ends up determining how long that war lasts politically. Which means while missiles are flying overseas, the narrative war here at home is only just getting started. Kristi Noem walked into a Senate hearing expecting the usual partisan theater. Democrats take their shots, Republicans defend the administration, and the whole thing plays out like the standard partisan tug of war everyone in Washington has seen 1,000 times. But that's not what happened. Instead of the predictable partisan split, criticism started coming from both sides of the aisle. Democrats were pressing Noem hard, which wasn't surprising. But Republicans started raising their own concerns as well. And that's the moment when a hearing stops being routine and starts becoming politically dangerous. Lawmakers kept circling the same issue again and again. They believe Noem has been pushing the envelope with some of her decisions, and not in a way that's strengthening the administration's position. The criticism wasn't subtle. members of Congress were openly questioning Noem's judgment, Noem's leadership, and whether some of the moves coming out of the department have crossed a line. And once criticism starts crossing party lines in Washington, the ground underneath an administration official can shift pretty quickly. It stops being a partisan argument and starts becoming a question about whether the person running the department has become more of a problem than a solution. Some lawmakers didn't even bother easing into that conversation. A few of them raised the question directly: should Kristi Noem resign, or should she be fired? Once that question gets said out loud during a hearing, the entire dynamic changes. It's no longer about defending one policy decision. It becomes a conversation about whether someone can politically survive in the job. Right now, Noem is still the Secretary of Homeland Security, and the administration hasn't signaled any move to replace her. But the tone of those hearings sent a very clear signal. Members of Congress from both parties believe Noem's been pushing the envelope, and they're increasingly convinced she's been pushing it the wrong way. In Washington, when bipartisan criticism starts building like that, it usually means one thing: the pressure isn't going away. And when the pressure keeps building, the question eventually becomes how much longer someone's tenure can realistically last. And in Washington, when that question starts getting asked out loud by both parties, it usually means the clock has already started ticking. And finally, there's a moment in every crisis where reality stops sounding like a government briefing and starts sounding like something out of a dark comedy sketch. And right now, for Americans stuck in parts of the Middle East as this war spreads, we may have reached that moment. The U.S. government has been warning Americans across the region to get out if they can. Leave Iran, leave neighboring countries, leave the area before the situation gets worse. That's the official message. And on paper, that sounds responsible. If danger is growing, warn your citizens. But here's the problem. A lot of people can't just snap their fingers and leave the Middle East. Flights get canceled, airspace closes, airports shut down. When missiles and drones start flying around a region, commercial travel suddenly gets complicated. Some Americans are scrambling right now in the Middle East trying to find any way out before this war escalates further. And the U.S. government did what governments usually do in these situations. They provided a phone number, a number Americans in the region were told they could call if they were stuck or needed assistance getting out of the Middle East. So naturally, people do what the government tells them to do. They called that government number for help. And that's where the story starts to feel almost absurd. Because Americans calling that emergency number have reported hearing a recorded message that says, and I kid you not, "Please do not rely on the U.S. government for assisted departure or evacuation at this time." Let that sink in for a second. You're an American overseas. A war is expanding in the region. Your government tells you to call if you need help. And the message you hear is essentially, don't depend on us to get you out. Now look, evacuations in the middle of a conflict aren't simple. No one thinks the government can just send a helicopter to every American who wants to leave. There are airspace restrictions, security risks, diplomatic coordination. War zones are chaotic. But telling people to get out while also telling them you might not be able to help them get out is the kind of contradiction that makes people understandably nervous. Because when I hear that message, it doesn't sound like a government with a clear plan. It sounds like a government that started something without thinking through the consequences for its own citizens. When Americans are being told to leave a region sliding toward war, the first thing their government should be thinking about is their safety. How do we help them? What's the evacuation framework? What's the plan if flights shut down? Instead, people are hearing a recording that basically says, "Good luck. May the odds be ever in your favor." And if you're one of the Americans stuck there tonight trying to figure out how to get home safely, I can't imagine that message inspires a lot of confidence. Americans are trying to get out of a region engaged in open conflict. That phone message isn't just frustrating, it's terrifying. Because when a government tells its own citizens to leave a war zone, but can't tell them how they're supposed to get out or even help them, that's not a plan. That's chaos. And Donald, the delusional one, created that chaos. The guy who doesn't care about anyone, especially Americans in another country potentially dying because they're just to Trump collateral damage. Trump's ego is more important than the lives of Americans. Wolfpack listeners, we need to keep the pressure on the Republicans in Congress and in the Senate. Call them. Pressure them. Let them know you're fed up with the treatment of Americans in our country and abroad. The time for action is now, not tomorrow. The threads of our country's fabric are unraveling at an alarming rate. Our democracy is becoming a vague idea. All of us need to make sure that America and democracy doesn't become a distant memory. Donald Trump is a disastrous president and even a worse human being. We demand action from the Republican leadership immediately. If you agree with me, you're a listener, you're listening to me hopefully to the end. If you agree with what I'm saying, then please join wolf.org. Type that in your browser, joinwolf.org. With so many people listening to my podcast, I can't believe each and every one of you are not a member yet. What's holding you up? Join the growing list of people across this country who are against fascism and against dictatorship. Join our call to action to have Trump removed from office by legal means. Thousands of collective voices together could make the difference. Join wolf.org today. I'll be back again Friday. I pride myself in doing this podcast without the bullshit, without the fake anger, without phony headlines and stories like a lot of the other podcasters do. And I sincerely hope that's appreciated. I'm Jeff Allen Wolf. This is A World Gone Mad. Wolfpack listeners, at a time when truth is getting buried under lies and too many of the wrong voices are telling all of us what to think, it's time to take a stand. Be skeptical, question everything. Don't lose hope. And most of all, stay alert.